Today, we are looking at a case from the Gilded Age. So sit back as we go to Poughkeepsie, New York. In the chill of late autumn 1891, a quiet boarding house on Mill Street stood at the center of a tragedy that would ripple through Dutchess County. A woman died in her bed after a brief illness. The attending doctor called it gastritis. However, questions soon gathered like the early evening fog on the Hudson. A husband's purchases, a cluster of letters, and the chemistry of a gray powder would tell a different story. The name that entered the papers was Edwin Thorne. According to reports at the time, the name may have been a courtesy to shield his extended family from further notoriety. What mattered to the community, and later to the courts, was the sequence of events that led from a modest life to a courtroom packed with spectators, and finally to a sentence that turned once private sorrow into public record. Following the initial shock, neighbors recalled a household that had seemed ordinary. Edwin had worked with figures and invoices, not with weapons. His wife, Clara, born Clara May Bennett, kept to a routine of errands and church meetings. Nothing in that routine predicted the inquiries that began once the coroner's office looked beneath the surface. Soon after, detectives carried away a blue bottle, a ledger page torn from an apothecary's book, and several letters that spoke softly of money, worry, and a husband's private calculations. By October 20th, 1891, Poughkeepsie residents began to speak in low tones about the Thorne case. The story that unfolded in the press had none of the lurid excess that sometimes colored city crime columns. Instead, it centered on documents, receipts, and testimony, details that the American courts relied upon to reach their conclusions. From background to sentence, the chain of causation would become the backbone of the state's case. Edwin Thorne had not grown up in Poughkeepsie. He was born in the early 1860s in Millbrook, a rural part of Dutchess County where small farms met the carriage road. His father had traded in hides and feed, and family expectations followed the familiar pattern of the time: respectability through steady work, careful speech, and dues paid at church and lodge. Edwin had learned penmanship and arithmetic at a district school, then worked in a feed supply office before moving to Poughkeepsie in the mid-1880s. There he took a clerk's position with a wholesale grocer near the riverfront. He boarded in a series of houses, finally taking a room at 114 Mill Street in the spring of 1889. He married Clara on June 10, 1889, at a small Methodist chapel. She had kept books in a notion shop on Main Street. Friends later told officers that Clara had been gentle and even-tempered, the kind who remembered birthdays and brought baked goods to sick neighbors. The couple's first months together appeared ordinary. They lived in 2 small rooms at the boarding house run by Mrs. Eliza Hart. Edwin's wages covered rent and basic comforts, and Clara occasionally mended clothing to add a few dollars. However, the calm could not withstand the disruptions that followed. In late 1890, Edwin's employer shortened hours during a slow season, and by January 1891, the couple had fallen behind on rent. Meanwhile, Clara suffered bouts of indigestion after a hard winter. A physician recommended rest and simple food, but work and money were not easily set aside. The next pressure point arrived by post. In March 1891, Edwin received notice that a promissory note he had co-signed years earlier was coming due. He had few resources beyond his reputation and his wife's thrift. According to letters later read in court, he brooded over the debt and the loss of standing it implied. He began to speculate about insurance, first a modest policy on household goods, then something larger. By April, the couple met with a local agent who explained the terms of life insurance. The first policy, taken out in Edwin's name, was small. A second policy, on Clara, followed in early May. The agent would testify later that he saw nothing unusual in the request. Many couples, he explained, protected themselves against the hazards of illness. The couple's domestic routine strained under rumor. A young milliner, known in testimony as Miss H., rented the rear parlor downstairs. She and Clara shared tea, then grew distant when talk in the house turned toward Edwin's late evenings and whispered conversations in the hallway. Contemporary accounts differ on whether Edwin had formed an attachment outside his marriage. Some boarders claimed they had heard only quarrels about money. Others reported that Clara grew anxious when Edwin stayed out past midnight on paydays and that she kept a small notebook of household accounts that she guarded closely. By summer, Edwin had stabilized his position at work, but not his debts. He borrowed from a co-worker and paid one creditor while delaying another. His pride suffered. He was seen studying the newspaper advertisements for tonics and pest remedies, and he asked the apothecary about rat poison for the kitchen. On September 28th, he brought home a paper-wrapped packet and placed it in the locked drawer of a small desk. Clara remarked on the smell of chemicals in the room. He said little. On the evening of October 12, 1891, Clara fell ill. She complained of stomach pains and fatigue after a simple supper. The landlady sent for the physician who had attended Clara before, Dr. Henry L. Archer. He arrived near midnight, examined Clara, and prescribed a mild carminative. The next day Clara felt weak but insisted on sitting up for an hour. Edwin remained at work, returning at noon. He said she should rest and offered tea. By late afternoon she was again in distress. Dr. Archer returned and stayed for an hour. He remarked to Mrs. Hart that the symptoms resembled severe gastritis. He left a bottle of laudanum, with instructions for small doses to ease pain. By early morning on October 14th, Clara's condition had worsened. She suffered repeated vomiting and became drowsy and confused. Around dawn she asked for water and then fell back onto the pillows. Dr. Archer returned but could do little. She died shortly after 7 a.m. The physician signed a certificate of death due to acute gastritis, aggravated by exhaustion. He recommended burial without delay, as the weather remained unseasonably warm for October. Soon after, a small detail unsettled Mrs. Hart. She noticed that the blue bottle of laudanum on the bedside table had been moved and was nearly empty, although the prescribed dose was small. She also recalled the paper packet Edwin had kept in the desk. Later that day, as she gathered linens, she discovered a scrap of paper beneath the desk blotter that read, "Arsenic, ½ ounce." She told a neighbor, who advised her to speak to the police. By the following morning, October 15th, she had visited the Poughkeepsie police station on Main Street and spoke with Sergeant William Pratt. He, in turn, informed the Dutchess County coroner. The coroner's office convened a jury and ordered Clara's body to be exhumed. Dr. Archer, who had signed the initial certificate, assisted and then stepped back as another physician, Dr. Theodore James, conducted the autopsy. The Marsh test, used commonly by the period's chemists, indicated the presence of arsenic in the stomach contents. This finding did not alone prove administration by another's hand, but it redirected the inquiry. Officers searched the Thorne rooms with the coroner's warrant, seizing the laudanum bottle, the paper scrap, and several letters in Edwin's bureau. They also visited Demorest's apothecary on Market Street, where the proprietor, Mr. William Demorest, produced a ledger entry dated October 10 for arsenic, 1/2 ounce, purchased by a man he identified as Edwin. Edwin did not flee. He presented himself at the police station on October 16th, after learning that officers had visited his workplace. He stated that he had purchased arsenic to kill rats in the boarding house kitchen, and had placed the powder in the locked desk drawer. He denied giving it to Clara. He explained that she had taken laudanum in excess because of her pain. He also insisted that rumors of an attachment to another woman were unfounded. He requested counsel. Meanwhile, investigators traced the life insurance policy taken on Clara in May. The policy was small, but the timing troubled the coroner's jury, which had been moving cautiously through their task. Testimony from the insurance agent described Edwin as attentive to details and concerned about premiums. Letters found in the bureau included one to a creditor, written in a steady hand and dated September 30, in which Edwin promised payment within 6 weeks. A second letter, unsigned, set aside in an envelope with no stamp, outlined his dislike of the indignities of constant debt. According to the officers, the letter contained no confession but showed strain. The coroner's jury returned a finding on October 22 that Clara had died from arsenic poisoning and that sufficient evidence existed to charge Edwin with her murder. The Dutchess County District Attorney filed an information, and the case moved toward the winter term of the county's court of Oyer and Terminer in Poughkeepsie. Edwin was transferred to the county jail. He remained composed and continued to assert his innocence. The trial opened on January 12, 1892, in a courtroom crowded with townspeople and visitors from Millbrook. The presiding justice addressed the jurors about their duties and cautioned them against speculation. The prosecution, led by the district attorney, presented a narrative of gradual planning, financial pressure, the acquisition of arsenic under the pretext of pest control, and the administration of poison in the days before death. The defense counsel, Charles F. Winslow of New York City, summarized a different account: a house plagued by rats, a husband attentive to an ailing wife, and a fatal misadventure through improper dosing of laudanum by a woman in pain. Witnesses appeared in careful order. First, the landlady, Mrs. Eliza Hart, described the couple's tenancy, the illness, and the discovery of the paper scrap. She was measured and composed. On cross-examination, defense counsel emphasized her concern about household pests and her request to boarders earlier that year to help with vermin in the pantry. She affirmed that she had indeed raised the subject in August. Next, Mr. Demorest, the apothecary, testified to the ledger entry of October 10. He identified Edwin as the purchaser and explained the ordinary uses of arsenic as a rat poison. He stated that, under the customs of the time, arsenic was sold with basic cautions. The defense pressed him on whether the amount sold was excessive. He answered that ½ an ounce was not unusual for a kitchen plagued by rodents. He recalled warning Edwin not to confuse the powder with any food or drink and to label any mixture plainly. He stated he could not testify to what Edwin did with the powder after leaving the shop. Dr. Archer described his October visits, the symptoms he observed, and his initial diagnosis of gastritis. He stated that, at the time, he had suspected no malicious act. He also described the bottle of laudanum he had left and his instructions for dosing. On cross-examination, the defense elicited that severe pain and vomiting could lead a patient to take more of a sedative than recommended, especially in the absence of constant supervision. The doctor conceded that such overuse could worsen a patient's condition. Dr. James, the autopsy physician, presented the results of his examination and the Marsh test. He stated that arsenic was present in quantities consistent with poisoning and that the timeline of symptoms matched acute exposure. He explained the limitations of the test and confirmed that, while arsenic could be accidentally ingested, such accidents were rare in a controlled household. He also noted that arsenic could exist in rat poisons and in certain medicinal preparations of earlier decades, but that Clara had not been prescribed any such compounds. Following medical testimony, the prosecution introduced the insurance agent, who recounted Edwin's questions about premiums and the second policy taken on Clara. He stopped short of suggesting that insurance alone proved motive, but he asserted that, taken together with debt and opportunity, it supported premeditation. The defense challenged the insinuation, noting that many respectable households carried small policies and that drawing sinister conclusions from ordinary prudence would be unfair. A co-worker from the warehouse testified about Edwin's character at work. He described him as punctual but distracted in September and October. The man recalled seeing Edwin study a small notebook during lunch and then close it quickly when approached. The defense objected to speculation about the notebook's contents. The court instructed the jury to consider only what was observed and not to infer beyond the witness's knowledge. Finally, Edwin's own statement, taken by a magistrate shortly after his arrest, was read in court. In it, he acknowledged the purchase of arsenic for rat control and stated that he had prepared a small quantity dissolved in water, placed in a dish in the kitchen, and labeled it. He denied any administration to Clara. He acknowledged, with visible strain, that he had considered his debts and the life insurance policy. He stated that he had hoped for a new start by paying creditors with expected raises in the coming year. He concluded by asserting that he had loved his wife and had not harmed her. The defense proposed an alternative theory, that Clara, in a period of severe suffering, had taken laudanum incorrectly, that arsenic present in the kitchen for rat control might have contaminated some implement, and that the state had failed to show, beyond a reasonable doubt, the deliberate administration of poison by Edwin. Counsel suggested that the state's timeline was too tidy, the motive too generalized, and the chemistry too imprecise to support a capital conviction. The prosecution's closing argument emphasized causation. They pointed to the apothecary's ledger, the torn paper in the desk, the laudanum bottle nearly empty, and Clara's rapid decline. They argued that Edwin had both the means and the opportunity, and that his finances and the insurance showed motive. They reminded jurors that while arsenic might be used against rats, its presence in Clara's body, coupled with the timing of symptoms, weighed heavily against accident. They requested a verdict of murder in the first degree. The judge's instructions described the degrees of homicide under New York law. He explained premeditation in plain terms and reminded the jurors that they must find the elements beyond a reasonable doubt. He cautioned them that motive, while relevant, did not substitute for proof of the act itself. He instructed them on how to consider expert testimony and on the limits of circumstantial evidence, noting that such evidence could support a conviction if the chain of circumstances excluded reasonable hypotheses of innocence. The jury retired mid-afternoon on January 21, 1892. According to accounts from the courtroom, they requested the ledger book and the autopsy report. They returned the next morning after deliberating through the evening. They found Edwin Thorne guilty of murder in the second degree. The courtroom remained quiet. The judge thanked the jurors and set a date for sentencing. Sentencing occurred on February 6, 1892, at the Dutchess County Courthouse. The court imposed a sentence of life imprisonment. In imposing sentence, the judge remarked that, while the jury had not found premeditation sufficient for a first-degree conviction, the evidence showed a grave offense against domestic trust. He commended counsel on both sides for their conduct. Edwin listened and stood without gesture. An appeal followed. Counsel sought relief from the New York Court of Appeals on the grounds that the trial court had admitted the insurance testimony in a manner that unfairly prejudiced the jury and that the Marsh test results lacked proper corroboration. They also challenged certain remarks in the prosecution's closing argument, arguing that the prosecutor had invited jurors to speculate beyond the evidence. The appellate process moved slowly. By late autumn 1892, the Court of Appeals affirmed the conviction. The court's opinion, reported in legal periodicals of the day, emphasized that the trial judge had carefully instructed the jury and that the evidentiary decisions fell within discretion. It observed that motive evidence, while delicate, had been accompanied by substantial proof of means and opportunity. Edwin entered state prison soon after. He kept a low profile. According to later notes in the prison registry, he worked in the bindery and avoided disciplinary marks. He did not seek a retrial. Letters from his family dwindled. Inquiries from the press ceased. Meanwhile, in Poughkeepsie, Mrs. Hart continued to run the boarding house for a time before retiring to live with a daughter in Kingston. Dr. Archer carried a measure of regret for his initial certificate. He continued in practice, explaining to younger physicians the caution required when illness followed close on the heels of household poisons. Clara's grave, in a small cemetery on the edge of the city, saw attention in the months after the sentencing. Fresh flowers appeared during springtime of 1892 and 1893. A church committee raised a modest stone. The inscription did not mention how she died. Contemporaries did not agree on the case's wider meaning. Some saw in it a cautionary tale about life insurance when coupled with hidden debt. Others emphasized the risks of powerful household substances in small rooms among hurried people. In the years that followed, the case drifted from conversation to memory. It left no sweeping legal precedent and no sensational literature. Yet it lingered in the county's institutional files as a record of methodical work, a landlady's careful observations, an apothecary's ledger, a doctor's duty to revise an initial impression when new facts emerged. The case reinforced the way local juries weighed circumstantial chains, how purchase, possession, opportunity, and motive might intersect to show guilt without a witness to the act itself. It also reminded physicians of the hazards of quick certification and the need for caution when signs failed to fit a familiar pattern. Measured against the crowded history of 19th century America, the Thorne case remained. Nonetheless, it illuminated enduring themes. Private financial pressure could touch the public sphere. Domestic spaces, thought to be safe, could become sites of harm. Institutions, the boarding house, the apothecary, the coroner's office, the court, formed a sequence in which ordinary people did their jobs and thereby recovered a story that had first appeared to be natural misfortune. The jury's verdict of second-degree murder balanced suspicion with restraint, acknowledging grave wrongdoing but refusing to amplify uncertain inferences into a capital sentence. By the end of the century, the case had become the stuff of local memory and the occasional mention in county histories. No subsequent confession arrived to complicate the record. No startling new witness stepped forward. The epilogue belonged to the paper trail, a cluster of receipts, a court docket, a prison registry, and a gravestone. That paper trail preserved the chronology and causation that American juries rely on. Though the name Edwin Thorne may have been a reporter's shield, the facts that mattered remained in the test tubes and in the ledger lines. This story, like many from the Gilded Age, showed a justice system adapting to new tools and new expectations. Chemistry entered the courtroom alongside handwriting experts and insurance agents. The coroner's jury, a relic of English practice, still had a role in moving a case toward indictment. The judge spoke carefully, the jurors listened, and the community accepted a sentence that placed the offender beyond the city's gates. On that foundation, the case settled into history, not as spectacle, but as a study in how small details, calmly examined, can speak with authority. Thank you for watching. If you have thoughtful observations about the evidence or the era, feel free to share them in the comments.